All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am Franco. I have on a guest who I'm glad I finally have on. I've known about Keith McHenry for a long time, and he is the co-founder of the Food Not Bombs movement. I and I hope that what we talk about here inspires a lot of you to not only help Food Not Bombs, but also it gets you to want to do some kind of activism too, or to do about anarchism. So, Keith, it's great to have you on the show, man. How are you?
Very good. It's been a pretty interesting week or so.
Yeah, yeah. So, you want to tell us how you got started with Food Not Bombs? I know you've been an activist for a couple decades now, and I believe this started in around the 1980s, right?
Yeah, well, I've been an anarchist for 50 years, and I helped start the original Food Not Bombs in 1980 with seven other friends. And so at that time, the group of us, the seven of us, were protesting against Seabrook Nuclear Power Station in Seabrook, New Hampshire. And So on May 24th, there was this effort to climb over the fences and take over the construction site. And one of our friends, the original eight, Brian Feigenbaum, was arrested. And so that evening, we raised money. We found a guy with enough money to bail Brian out and felony assault of police officer charges. And on the way back down to Boston, we thought, well, we've got to raise money to pay him back, so we should do bake sales. And so we were doing these bake sales outside of BU Law, where he was a law student, and in Harvard Square. And we were really making no money. And I also had a moving company called Smooth Move. So I was moving this family, and had a poster they were throwing out called that said, "Wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed, and the Air Force had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber?" So we went and bought some military uniforms at the Army Navy surplus store and set out our baked goods and with our sign, and it caught people's attention. And we thought this is like a really great way to organize, to get public attention about Seabrook and uh, and um, and why we were protesting and everything, and about militarism. The other thing that was happening was I was a produce worker at Bread and Circus, which is now Whole Foods in Central Square, Cambridge,
Mm.
and I felt bad. I was throwing away all this produce every morning after I cleaned out the stalls and stuff, and I would take it to this housing project on Portland Ave, which was about 3 or 4 blocks away. And one day, the mothers that were getting the food were like, this new building across the street is where they designed nuclear weapons, and it was called Draper Lab. I thought, wow, that would be a really good name for something. So I made a flyer that said, we were at the moment we were called the Food for Free Committee, and so I made a flyer though with a headline that said, "Food Not Bombs will never sell out," and we decided, no, let's just take that as our name. And then as things were going, we realized that really the core problem with Seabrook Nuclear Power Station was the people investing in it making money, which was primarily the Bank of Boston. And so we decided we would, and at this time, Reagan had just gotten elected. It was March 26, 1981. And we decided to do a street performance in front of the stockholders meeting outside the Federal Reserve Bank. And we would dress up like hobos, like the 30s, like the Great Depression. And we didn't really feel like we had gotten enough energy amongst our friends to make a whole line of people dressed like hobos. So I went to the Pine Street Inn in the middle of the night, which was like a shelter that had existed from the Great Depression, and and talked to the guys in there about midnight. Gave a little speech about why we're protesting, and they're like, "Oh, this is so cool. We should. Well, it's like the '60s. We'll come." And so they did. And so there was this line of about 30 some people waiting to eat our soup. And passersby, some of the like stockholders were like, "That's great. This bank sucks. Others are like, "Oh, this is horrible what you're doing." And I remember this one young businessman coming out of South Station, which was right there, and he's like, "Wow, Reagan's only been in office like a little over a month, and there's already soup lines in America." And the guys that came to eat, and there was this one woman that came also. They were telling us like, "There's no food for homeless people in Boston. You know, we go to the inn, they give us Dunkin' Donuts and a cup of coffee, and send us to the streets, and then we come back at night and we get another donut and some more coffee. And it'd be great if you did this every day." So that evening, we decided we just quit our jobs and do nothing but collect food and take it to housing projects and do street theater with meals every day. And so that's what we did. It was
Awesome,
pretty
awesome.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it is amazing, and it's now grown into this global organization, right? So, how did you get it to
Well, so the way we
how? Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so what happened was that we so I got in a lot of trouble in Boston for doing this eventually. It was cool at first, and the city government actually of Cambridge supported three protests against the nuclear arms race with food not bombs. But then there became like by '85, there became a lot of pressure to get rid of homeless people again, and so that was building and building. And so I had a campaign again with a bunch of other friends and with Food Not Bombs itself in this neighborhood I lived in to stop the efforts to kick out the homeless because we were really dear friends with many of the people living on the streets there. This is near Fenway Park in Boston. And so I ended up, because of that, like having to move to San Francisco. Well, I had to move, and then I chose San Francisco. So I thought, well, it's the most liberal city in America. It'll be even probably more amazing than Boston. And so we started to set up every Monday at noon at the end of Haight Street, Haight and Stanton, at the entrance to Golden Gate Park. And we chose Mondays because there was food for people in the Haight Ashbury, and the park was real big, and a lot of unhoused people lived in the park. So we did it every Monday, and you could see for like 2 blocks our sign saying "Food Up Bombs," and you could see it. We had a literature table, and all the tourists would come by and get our stuff, and it was a really cool thing. And then this hippie came by and goes, "Oh wow, you can get a permit to do this." And in Cambridge, we had like a street performance permit. It cost no money. There was no requirements, and it was really to return your equipment if you left it on the streets. So I thought, stupidly, that that was what I was applying for. And I waited like every once in a while the cops would come by on a Monday and say, "Hey, did you get your permit?" And then I'd go over to the office where I sent the letter, and they didn't know what I was talking about. So on August 15th of 1988, 45 riot police came out of Golden Gate Park and arrested 9 of us for serving food without a permit. And this Greg Garr, this local photographer from the Haight Ashbury, got a photo in the San Francisco Chronicle the next day of riot police guarding the food. And people were outraged. And so a meeting was called, and we decided we'd do it again the next Monday. And so people marched down the street again, and carrying the food. In this case, we set up a march and marched from Center Street from this one park to the Haight Ashbury, banging pots and pans and everything. And one guy, in fact, had I think a Star Trek a painting of one of the Star Trek characters and leading the march, and it was very festive. And I think that day about 24 people were arrested for serving food. Oddly enough, the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force was also there, and they filed a memo to the San Francisco field office of the FBI saying that we were a credible national security threat on August 29th, 1988. But that generated even more news. So I'm pretty sure that's the arrest where the New York Times covered it, the Times of India, London Times. CNN actually had video of the arrest and aired worldwide. And so people became really upset about that. And this every week we'd have these. The next week we had another march down the street, and eventually on Labor Day, 54 people were arrested for serving food at Golden Gate Park. But that energy of that upset people so much that they called or wrote letters asking how they could start a food not bombs to be in defiance of the city of San Francisco's policy. So I ended up writing, I had notes on how I started the San Francisco group. So I made a flyer called Seven Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs, and I would mail that to you. And that's how all these other groups started. And then there'd be another wave of arrests. The next year, there was homeless people set up a camp in front of City Hall to protest police violence. And then we were invited to serve food there. So we did a 24-hour a day vegan restaurant for 27 days in front of City Hall. And then the police eventually arrested us for that. And that made more news. And more people wrote us and asked how they could start a Food Not Bombs chapter. So then I faced 25 to life in prison at one point. So that in the California three strikes law. So that generated a whole bunch more news, and more people wanted to start Food Not Bombs. And eventually we actually did our first world gathering in San Francisco on the 500th anniversary of Columbus invading the Americas. And there was a huge, San Francisco, Nancy Pelosi was able to arrange to have San Francisco be the official celebration for the 500th, the quincentennial. And Native people all over the world united to do protests against this there. And so in solidarity, we fed their protests, but we did a world gathering. And that's where we came up with the three principles of Food Not Bombs, which is the food is always vegan or vegetarian and free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober. That there's no leaders or presidents or headquarters, and that each group is autonomous and makes decisions using consensus, and encourages the people that are relying on the food to participate in forming the direction of each local chapter. And that the third principle is that we're not a charity, but that we're dedicated to taking nonviolent direct action to change society, so no one has to live in the streets or eat at a soup kitchen. Then people left there, and I'd written a book by that time called Food Not Bombs: How to Feed the Hungry and Build Community, and it came out that October as well. Then in '95 we had the next world gathering, and about 1,000 people showed. That's where we started indie media. We had pirate radio station by that time. We were Homes Not Jails with another project we started where we're taking over abandoned buildings during the savings and loan crisis. And there was I think 130 some people arrested for feeding people during that gathering. There was also people arrested taking over these empty military housing at the Presidio Army base and things like that. So it just kept spreading out. And then also punk bands got really involved in promoting Food Not Bombs. So like MDC and Propagandhi, Aleve, Bad Brains, Rancid, all these bands started having in their liner notes stuff about how to start a Food Not Bombs. And particularly like in the Philippines, punk band from Europe traveled through the Philippines, and they would stop at every city they did a gig. They would buy kettles for the local people, and they would do a Food Not Bombs action. And they left 50 different cities with Food Not Bombs in the Philippines. Another punk band toured Indonesia. By the time they were done, there were over 100 cities in Indonesia that had chapters. So it was that combination of, like when they arrested people in Orlando for feeding people, more groups would start. Now people are starting groups. I think the news that Houston Food Not Bombs is being ticketed every day for serving food, or nearly every day, at the library. That's generating more interest, and basically the collapse of the economy and society is encouraging lots of people to contact us all the time to start new Food Not Bombs. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it looks like the bad press was kind of helping you guys too. There's a lot of challenges along the way. It looks like the terrorist organization, I believe, right?
Yeah. So when we got that first, I found out only about 2 years ago that we were declared a credible national security threat in this memo, in this FOIA project that I'm always working on. But at the time of back then, people were going to, we went home for Thanksgiving, and we people would have the Food Not Bombs button on their coats, and National Guards people would go, "Hey, we just studied them this weekend. That's one of America's most hardcore terrorist groups." And and what is interesting is, at that point there was roughly 30 Food Not Bombs volunteers in the world. There was 10 in Long Beach, California. There were about 10 of us in San Francisco, and another 10 in Boston. So it's kind of interesting that the name, what we ascertained is that in fact, this was confirmed by the State Department in April of 2009 at a lecture at the Tufts Tufts School for Diplomacy. State Department official was comparing the people that serve vegan meals in the parks to Al Qaeda. Who's more dangerous? And their analysis was um, that we were like indigenous to our communities, people liked us, and that we were a threat because it might encourage the American public to think money should be diverted from military spending to healthcare, education, and other social services. And so it was the message of Food Not Bombs, which is what is so objectionable. The fact that it's, they're not handling poverty, because you can see we show up with vegan meals and you have lines of people coming to eat, and it's under the banner Food Not Bombs, and it just is right in your face that this is, our priorities in the United States are completely upside down. And of course, it turns out that that's similar throughout the world. We're now in at least 1,000 cities, maybe many more, and at least 65 countries.
Well, yeah, yeah. The name really like is in your face with the elite class or predator class want to do, which is to go to war with different countries to take resources and stuff. And then you guys are promoting we should be focusing on feeding the people, meeting these people's basic needs,
Yeah,
the ruling class's best interest.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it's that's one. This is actually probably the best time in history of all the history of anarchism to be an anarchist, because the 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 state is not coming through with the stuff that people need, like food, housing, the resources that are essential, and that's really. But yet, mutual aid projects like Food Not Bombs, we are the ones that are coming through with those things. And as the society collapses completely, and we can see that even here in Santa Cruz, California, where I live. So when the lockdowns happened, all the soup kitchens closed because they were all indoors. So then we took up the mantle, because we know the people living outside at that what on the day of the lockdown on March 14th, 2020, we were serving food every just on weekends, because the other soup kitchens were open through the rest of the time, but Monday through Friday, and so we were just filling that gap, sort of the way we were doing it at Haight Ashbury, and so so then the soup kitchens didn't open. They haven't even really opened yet, and so we took up that slack, and we did the meals every day now for over 3 years, and and the community totally loves us, even though the city government completely hates us. Because and we were evicted by the city from 8 locations. We were and just by the city itself, twice by the county, and twice by developers during the 3 years. And they made laws against us serving food, which we ignored. They gave us cease and desist orders, which we ignored. And it just, in fact, every time they tried to stop us here in Santa Cruz, people would read all the newspapers about, oh yeah, these guys got stopped. They can't serve food, and then they'd drive by, because we were always in a prominent location, and there we were. So it just built this idea that you just can ignore the government and continue forward with your project and not be interfered. And we were the fresh water for hundreds of homeless people. We were the meals for hundreds of homeless people. We were the tents and sleeping bags for people. We helped people fix their cars so that they wouldn't get towed by the police when they were living in their cars. We were basically the social service uh, agency, but we were also, I think, more importantly, we were autonomous from the state and we're completely independent. We were not getting money from them. It was money from other poor people to keep it going, and it just showed that really what's important is we had parties like live music every single holiday for the entire pandemic where people come out and dance and everything when you're supposed to be like stuck in your house and frightened out of your mind. And so we're just like completely flipped the entire thing around. And we were the mental health facility. We had to deal with really hardcore problems of people really, particularly right at the beginning. I mean, if anybody that was a little um, off anyway was like everybody was off. So it just the tension at the beginning was really outrageous. You know, I had some people would yell for 5 days straight near us and give you a dang headache. But
Dang.
we handled all that stuff and we showed that we could do it without like some corporate backing thing or some government support, and that's like what is key. And I think that as society continues to collapse, the people that are anarchists are going to be in the best position because we're not wed to some kind of system that pre-exists. We are able to move and float as reality occurs, as opposed to some kind of pre-defined idea of how everything's supposed to work.
So you said you've been an anarchist for like 50 years now. Do you think that, like, during that time, like when you first started being an anarchist, conversations about anarchism were going to reach to the level that they're at now? Did you think that the spotlight at how bad the government is right now was ever going to happen during like a long time ago when you first started becoming an anarchist?
Yeah, well. So when I first was an anarchist, there was the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
and I was very attracted to the yippies and all the stuff they were doing, at that Abbie Hoffman and all that, and so it was not really clear, being in the fifth grade, how things were going to go,
yeah.
but and then at that time also the Soviet Union existed. And so a lot of the left for up until the fall of the Berlin Wall was very dominated by different sectarian communist organizations. So anarchists, while there was a lot of us, we were sort of, on, we might have been doing a lot of the actual work to have stuff happen. But like, even to this day, I've only been on a national stage at a national rally one time. And that was because they had an extra 30 minutes to fill in Tampa during the Republican National Convention protest. And they just brought me out of off the streets to say something. But they're all usually dominated by these, like other organizations like Answer Coalition or whatever, and so I'm never invited in those things. But the thing is, when the Berlin Wall came down, anarchism just took off, and particularly in what we call Central Europe now, but what at the time was Eastern Europe. um, like, kids were doing food not bombs in all over the place, and they were. I remember in Poznan, Poland, visited. I spent a lot of time in that part of the world. Um, they'd seized a factory, and they had they were proud to have the largest anarchist library in Europe, and there was just an amazing scene where all these buildings were taken. The fanciest mansion in Prague was actually a squat by anarchists, because when the communists you know fell, they just took over the building. Even though really, what people pointed out was ultimately all the communist bosses of places like Bulgaria and so on just became Democrats and took over. Just they just changed their hat from being communist to capitalist, basically. Um, but still, there was a sort of fluidity that was really wonderful. And also, the other thing is a lot of the funding for um, communist groups in North America kind of dried up because of the lack of being able to get money through whatever initiatives were happening from the Soviet Union. So there was, I remember in San Francisco, actually, um, there was a big struggle over a building that they owned on Valencia Street when that happened, and so that's when really anarchism worldwide started to really take off. That our ideas started to be adopted by a much larger number of people. And I think now we're in that another version of that as the banking systems collapse, as there's this rush
Yeah.
to centralized digital currency, as they're heading towards a global war between nuclear armed nations, and the chaos is becoming outrageous. But if you're an anarchist, you can flow with that whole uh, trauma of that, because again, you're not wedded you're stuck, you're wedded to your principles, which is there's no hierarchy, and that's a horizontal organizing, and that you're with the community, and that the community is making the decisions of where to go at the community level, and not like governments determining what's happening. I call our government here because it's a permanent emergency status. They meet on Zoom basically, and although they just started having public meetings after 3 years, I call them celluloid avatars, because they just basically they don't make decisions other than about how to use the police to crush you, but they're not interested in actually providing any kind of basic way of people living in our community. They don't feed people, for example, or house people, for example.
So, what are your thoughts on CBDC, centralized central bank digital,
Well,
for
yeah,
people
central
to,
bank.
I guess, trade, or what are the ways? What do you think it would be the best way for people to exchange goods with each other? Yeah, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. Well, I think to start out at the current level of what's happening is to definitely um, always use cash, and but the main thing is to have access to food, water, housing, and to work cooperatively to have those things and to share them, and to not hoard or it's that's where the anarchist philosophy under these conditions is really important, because what you need is food and water and clothing and a warm place to be, and community, and those kinds of things. So an anarchist, this community is set up right away to be to handle that, and then you have to handle like your conflicts and so on, and do that in an honest way. And there are experiences I've had where somebody is a thug and they're trying to impose their will on a group of people because they see a vacuum that the state does not exist. So we've had to deal with that, particularly in homes not jails and the squatting movement. um, so yeah, definitely you don't want to get into this biometrics ID stuff. You don't
Right.
want to be using credit cards, and you don't want to be, you want to non-cooperate with the system. Totally, um, because that's going to be really dangerous. I think the most recent history, there was the truckers' blockade of Ottawa against the mandates, and you could see how they just cut people off digitally, like from GoFundMe's being confiscated by the government, and things like that. So we've already seen a taste of the danger of this authoritarian, centralized digital society. Um, and I think so there became like this idea, like in March 2020 in North America, that oh my God, we need to get support big pharma, and we need to support the military, and we need to support of left wing friends that I was working with my whole life, and And then I'm amazed at how many of my friends are all in on the Ukrainian war, and it's kind of frightening. But really, organizing against this all these like changes that are happening is a continuation of what we were already doing. So we were already protesting against NAFTA when that was happening. We were then protesting. I was very involved. I helped organize a tour called and went on a tour called the Unfree Trade Tour in 1997, where we're advocating if the World Trade Organization ever had a summit in North America, we should go there and shut it down. And then it was announced a year later it would be in Seattle, and that's exactly what we did in November of '99. And then there and so there was I was involved in going down to Cancun and protesting WTO down there. I was also working with people like Ronnie Cummings and Vandana Shiva to try to stop the patenting of seeds through Monsanto and the Millions Against Monsanto campaign. So there's just it's a seamless um, movement, which got somehow a lot of my uh, co-activists diverted at the at the with the COVID fear, and and hopefully a lot of that is shaking off now, as we could see that it's like obvious that that was a total scam at this point. Um, so so I think that just that the other thing that we're seeing right now, like when you're an anarchist, you are typically completely against censorship because you want you want to be open to all ideas. I mean, that's part of being an anarchist. Is it not that you have to agree with all ideas, but you have but to hear alternative ideas. And, it's like very core. That's like the First Amendment. That, and now we see that allies of ours are like in support of censorship, or don't even. I mean, I'm shocked sometimes to find people have no idea that there's online censorship. You know, because they never get censored because they don't have any opinions that are opposed to what the main narrative is. So I do think that thinking outside it's that community, being a community, being open minded to figuring out how to, not limiting your ideas of finding solutions. And so with the digital currency being imposed, um, you know, that I think just staying out of that whole system. So for instance, I've been out of that system largely for the entire 50 years. I did not use a social security number for years and years and years. For most of my adult life, I was completely outside of the state, and I did a graphic design company in Boston for many years, and I did work with with people that were connected to the state, Boston Red Sox, for example, and the Boston Celtics and things like that. I did their graphic design for them, but I was not, I wasn't paying taxes. I wasn't, I was just paying my coworkers. I'd get them money. We'd all work together in the studio, making stuff. There was a wasn't a hierarchy. It was just like, okay, we're doing graphic design, and when can you come in, and what's your skill, and we'll teach you how to do stuff, and we're just like a separate. We were our own autonomous world, interacting with the world as it really exists. And, that's really important.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like the simplest way I can see it when it comes to um, like current tech trying to use is that under the wrong hands, they can use it to exploit us, to oppress us. So that's the message that I try to get out to people. Like some of this stuff may seem nice on the surface, like using or with our finances, but under the wrong hands, like right now the people who control things are greedy, and they've shown time and time again that they will exploit us. So that's something that people need to be aware of before they sign on to things like this.
Yeah, I just watched like an interesting report about the war in Ukraine. So before the war in Ukraine, after the coup in 2014, which is when the war really started, but even before that time, there's already plans to make Ukraine a digital state, and Ukraine's always been great for for exploitation because it's been run by the mob often
Yeah.
through the whole history since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But so anyway, they then once the Nazis and had such huge influence after the coup, and the CIA basically really is what was this. In fact, I think there's an interesting series of documents recently came out that the CIA has been manipulating Ukraine for since the 50s, and so anyway, they that became like the model digital nation, and then with the war, it really amped it up because to get all your services and is all on your smartphone in Ukraine, and they're one of the first countries to to supposedly use digital currency exclusively, although pallets of $100 bills are flooding into Ukraine at this, just like in Iraq, just like in Afghanistan. It's nothing different. But so that I think is a fascinating example of this
Right.
kind of transformation of trying to. And I think now in the United States they're really going for, part of this whole banking collapse, which is really kind of phony. I find it very interesting. You have FTX and this whole trip going on, and and where does this guy, Sam Bankman-Fried, get like suddenly a zillions of dollars to, and that then gets funneled through like Ukrainian National Bank and all these things, and like total exploitation with cryptocurrency and stuff. And then you get the Silicon Valley Bank, which is over where I am, and with the CEO, the CEO like leaves with, I think they took out something like what, like $30 billion, like just the couple of days. He took out 13 billion, I think, himself. But many people, they are all just taking all the money out. Well, he was also on the the San Francisco Federal Reserve, same guy. And it was just like another scam. So a lot of this manipulation of this banking chaos is intentional. And then I recall also, remember there was like an oil spill in North Carolina, and then there was a ransomware case that was going on with the same oil company, right? And that was what the news was, the ransomware. And then oddly enough, the FBI got all the money from the ransomware. Well, it would not surprise me if the FBI did the ransomware case itself, and so on, and they used it to hide getting rid of cryptocurrency. We need law. Criminals are using cryptocurrency. We got to outlaw cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency being a competitor to central bank digital currency. It's just that. So there's all these interesting things behind the scenes that are going on, that are trying to advance this like one kind of centralized economic and political system, and it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. So what were some of the things that attracted you to anarchism?
Well, though I got started to being an anarchist when my father gave me Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and the Vietnam War was happening, and my school had just been desegregated. I lived in Luray, Virginia, and so all the black people from the west side of the tracks were allowed into our public school at that time. There was signs that were colored only, white only signs in restrooms and so on. When growing up, and my uncle was gonna be a ranger and die in Vietnam. He's all excited about that, and so I'm reading, but I just had learned to read because I had dyslexia, And so I was like, I'm not going to read all of Walden. I'm going to read. I'll read that short part in the back called "On Civil Disobedience." So he was. The main message there was, government governs best that governs least, and and he spent a night in jail, and for refusing to pay for the war, Mexican War, and for slavery. Well, it was parallel exactly to my own experience that I was as a child. So that was what really got me interested in it, and and like I say, I thought I found it interesting, like the anarchists in the anti-war movement, that you would come across their publications and things like that, because I didn't live that far from Washington D.C. Um, and so that whole kind of thing of like was really important. The other thing probably that had a huge influence on me was because I was not from Page County, which is where Luray is. I was an outsider, and I was frequently, beaten by the other students, and and I was in special education. And um, when they desegregated, all the black people suddenly had Down syndrome, just like me, and we were all in special education. And so, I got to see this kind of brutality and this class system, um, was right in my face. So that's one of the things. Another thing, though, I was, my grandfather, my grandfather and my mother's father was in the OSS in World War II, and he was directed the most deadly bombing campaign in world history called Operation Meeting House, and he had photos in his den in his home in Needham, Massachusetts, of the 63 bombing raids that he did over Tokyo, that he took from the bomb bay of a B-29 bomber. And he was grooming me to become part of that secret society. He was like in a satanic society. He was. Never knew whether he was recruited into it when he was at Phillips Andover, or if he was at Dartmouth or at Harvard Law. But he ended up within that elite group who, and he explained to me, that we're genetically superior. We have to determine the future of the world. We can't let we only have this pretend democracy in the United States as a way of dividing and conquering, so that but we'll never let real decisions be made by the general public because they're just too stupid. So he, was teaching me those kind of things whenever I visited him, for Christmas or whatever. And then he taught me about white man's burden. I'd have to determine who to kill and who not to kill, and the people you kill, have no moral ambiguity. They're dead, but you will have to live with those things. Now, on the flip side, my other grandfather was a park ranger, and on the way to be a one of the first junior park rangers at the Grand Canyon, he had crashed and was found injured in near a Hopi pueblo called Old Arribe. So he convalesced there with the Hopi, and became very good friends with the people that took care of him, and participated. Was witnessed their the snake dances and the green corn dances, and he's the only person to take photos inside of a active kiva. Which so anyway, he would take me when my family lived at the Grand Canyon. He would take us to the snake dances, and I was like in first grade and second grade, and I would see the young boys come out of the kiva and with the rattlesnakes in their mouths, and the antelope clan banging the huge drum and everything. And I got to stand like on the edge of Second Mesa Wapai, and above the graves of like 4,000 years of people who had passed away and been sacredly placed there. And there was no electricity in the four corners. I watched the footing for the Glen Canyon Dam be poured. All the cement trucks snaking down the walls of Glen Canyon. And I was fortunate enough to be in the area in the vast valley that was flooded to make Lake Powell, to see the Anastasi ruins and so on. So, and then he would be teaching me the Latin names of the sagebrush and the ponderosa and all these things, the geology. And so I had this interesting, one, at one point I'd get that education, the other I was going to be ruling the world education, and that totally transformed me. But then finally, the final thing that made me an anti-capitalist dramatically was I was on top of a peak in Utah when I was 16 years old, and I could see the smoke, black smoke, coming up all the valleys from Peabody Coal's operation of the generating plants near Shiprock, and then I went to one time to hang out with some friends in Sedona and see those horrible, ugly power lines going through the sacred land. Um, to me, I thought any kind of a economic and political system that would allow this beautiful, pristine, magical place to be so desecrated, what needed to be resisted with every ounce of energy that you have to the day you die. And so from that day on, that's been my focus.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, yeah. And then so during these like 50 years that you've been as an anarchist, would you say that you've come across certain books and have gone through certain experiences that have validated your views as an anarchist also?
Yeah, yeah. There's been a lot of very influential books besides Walden.
Yeah.
So I think one of my favorite, and I think one that every person interested in being an anarchist should read, is "Living My Life" by Emma Goldman. And would try to get the 2-volume version of that book, and it is the most. It's a it's a long read, but it's so valuable as to get an idea of our roots and the struggles, and it's incredible detailed history of anarchism in North America. So that is one book I really suggest. And then Berkman's book on anarchism. There's those are really fantastic books. Let's see. Then other books that are not specifically about anarchism, which were huge influences to me, was Francis Fox Piven, Regulating the Poor, and Poor People's Movements. Those two books. Now they're kind of from a Marxist perspective, um, but they do give you some hints on how the welfare system is part of social control, and this and that the reason that there is, that it's used to keep people from revolting. And I also found Dorothy Day's biographies very interesting. There's a lot I would not agree with, but it also gives you an interesting insight into. So she started the Catholic Workers Movement, and she, struggled with spirituality as an anarchist. But she was a young reporter in the Lower East Side and went to cover the hunger marches in Washington D.C., and that's what inspired her to start the Catholic Work Movement. So that's another area of interest. Also, Diet for a Small Planet. That had an influence in why Food Not Bombs adopted a vegan and vegetarian uh, diet. And it's also really weird how things flip too, because then you end up now, globalists are trying to promote a vegan diet. I mean, in fact, it's like everything or like, anti-racism and anti-sexism and anti-homophobia and stuff. And that's getting the capitalists are manipulating that into being a
Yeah.
weapon. I mean, basically everything that for 50 years, I've been involved in organizing around is now being morphed. And that was an
Yeah.
interesting thing I felt too. But the beginning of, like, when they chose Biden to be the president, you could see the this massive dash for controlled opposition, so that essentially it seemed like to me that like Food Not Bombs was because we were decentralized, even though there's a lot of Food Not Bombs chapters that were into the agenda. Um, Thankfully, because we're decentralized, they were not, and we aren't a money-based movement. They couldn't buy us out like they did with so many of the other movements that
Yeah.
all caved, with in March 2020.
Yeah,
So
it's unfortunate. Yeah,
yeah,
that's they try to co-opt everything that they see as like a threat. Certain buzzwords and stuff. Like you see the World Economic Forum using words like conservation,
yeah,
and like you were mentioning, like a vegan diet or lab grown meats and things like that, to try to try to attract people to them, make them think that they're doing good things. But at
yeah.
the end of the day, they're the ruling class, and they're not that conscious, and they're only looking out for their own interests, and they're gonna exploit people and control them. You try to control them.
Yeah, I think that people underestimate the level of mani- social manipulation that's intentional by think tanks and by um, by the military industrial complex has things. There are internal fights amongst them, which is thankfully a really great thing, for the what potentially could their whole efforts to centralize everything could be more effective. But at the same time, there's this human spirit that is very hard to crush, and
Mm.
so yeah, I find and I think there's a lot of hope, even though there is such a we are sort of it looks like we are really on the precipice of the Third World War. We can look back and see how the World War One was. The capitalists used that to gain more power and centralized control than they intentionally did World War Two for the same purpose. And my grandfather was very happy to explain why the U.S. did Pearl Harbor. Why did they set the whole thing up, move the Pacific Fleet into Pearl Harbor? Why they never warned anyone? Why they did the sanctions to pressure Japan and tried to blockade Japan until they felt, that set that up. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that's continuing to this day. We've had to deal with the police state as Food Not Bombs for a lot. We, as being, alleged terrorists, there's been a lot of focus on infiltration. I've had friends that do get unfortunately long prison terms as a result. They send they'll there's a lot of there's a you have to be my philosophy on the surveillance state is to just be true to yourself and say what you truly believe. And so, like, if I get called into court for criminal cases, I usually represent myself. I didn't do so on my three strike case, but because your integrity and your you know following your true path is the biggest defense to the surveillance state. And
Yeah.
but it exists, and it is very manipulative, and it's and I did like 500 days in jail in San Francisco for feeding people. I got tortured 3 times and placed in a stress fishing cage. But it's the human spirit is very strong, and that it's really you know um, that's what is our power, is that spirit, that
Mm-hmm.
resilience, that and it, nature, and knowing um, what are the real things, like water and air and those kind of things. That's the really important. And yeah, going into this digital transformation is inhumane, and I think people feel that. And if we
Yeah.
can stay connected, and I know there's like huge jumps, and this new bill that Mark Warner just put in, that they're using the TikTok thing for, this broadcast, you could get 20 years in prison if that passes. So they can target anybody for any electronic interaction. phone calls, email, YouTube, anything. It's pretty frightening. And the fact that they would even think to do that at this point and introduce it just shows their mentality. But it also shows this desperation of the
Yeah.
people in power. They're losing, they might lose control as they're trying to get more and more control. So for every action, there's an equal and opposite
Yeah.
reaction, essentially.
Yeah, I see it backfiring too. Like I'm also hopeful in the human spirit, like you were mentioning. Like if people are going to be letting their vices take over themselves, they're gonna have some unhappiness. Like if they're inside all day, just like I don't know, playing video games or just staying in this virtual world all the time. I think their bodies and their spirits are gonna be craving nature. They're gonna be craving what's real, and they're gonna want to go outside at some point. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm just saying that based on a gut feeling I have, and based on what I've seen with people around me when they spend too much time indoors on computers and stuff. They have cravings of going outside and uh, just like breathing air and like going for walks and things like that.
Yeah. And also for community, one of the beautiful, so the people, we're having this city war against the homeless, and I think it's probably a war across the whole country, really, against homeless. And so those people get to be outside all day.
Yeah.
um, and But we bring together this community. Um, uh, I call it the temporary autonomous zone after the book by Huckam Bay, um, which was called TAS, temporary autonomous zone, and um, and uh, and it's a version of a philosophy. There's a lot of anarchist philosophies, and he had one, and and so the but that not the 50 or 60 people that hang out together at the Food Not Bombs meal here all have different backgrounds and ideas and so on and struggles and you know people but there is a family and
Mm-hmm.
I think that pulled the people through this whole 3 years. So we were outside and in the fresh air or in the brutal. This was not pleasant, though. We've had 13 atmospheric rivers this winter, and so far I don't know of any of my friends have been killed by the atmospheric rivers. We of course have a lot of deaths from fentanyl, um, and it's interesting that the head of the police union in San Jose was importing massive tons of fentanyl and just got busted yesterday, I guess. And but I call the drugs are that stuff is we saw when the CIA set up the Bloods and the Crips back in the day with crack. It's a chemical war. Fentanyl is a chemical warfare by the government, and that's a way. When you're seeing expanding unhoused population, you want to put the government wants to put everything it can into disrupting that and to make sure there's no unity. And so, that's one of the tragedies of their program. And it also gets people that are housed to be pitted against people that are unhoused because once you're criminalized, as many people living on the streets have been, and they don't have access to a job because of and therefore, quite a number of people are get released from prison into the streets. Well, what are they going to do? They're the only is sell commodities, and that's capitalism, and that's what people do to survive. And I can't, I would not, that, meth heads are freaking annoying, but you gotta, you know, it's, you know, it's a part of the economic and political system. It's an intentional war, and that's
Yeah.
one of the means of dividing us.
Yeah.
So, so I I swim in that community all day, every day, and it just have to be understanding that where these people came from and how are they going to get to another place, and you can't get into drug rehab or something like that. Though people ask me all the time to help them do that, and I'm like vegan straight edge, so I think it's important to be clean and sober, and it's a real challenge, and all the bombardment of social, like this whole ideology that it's your personal failing and that it's a moral thing and so on, you know, that is all a construct that is directly designed to maintain power amongst the ruling elite, so.
Yeah. So you're also an author. You wrote the Anarchist Cookbook, right? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so years ago, in 1970, maybe even 69, this young man named William Powell wrote this book he called The Anarchist Cookbook, and he went to the main library on 42nd Street in Manhattan, and he went through any kind of how to make a bomb or poison people or booby traps and stuff like that. And his goal, he was not really an anarchist, from what I can tell. Um, and In fact, he had somebody from the Revolutionary Communist Party write the foreword to the Anarchist Cookbook. And his goal, though, was to avoid being drafted in the Vietnam War. So, I wrote Food Not Bombs: How to Feed the Hungry and Build Community. Then I wrote um, Hungry for Peace, which is a much more expanded version of the first book on how to do food not bombs, and that's the goal of that book, is the history of food not bombs and how to organize tours, how to make meals, and have you know vegan meals for 100 and vegan meals for six, family of six, and so on. So then people would buy the anarchist cookbook and be very angry that it didn't have anything about anarchism in it. So my publisher, Chaz Buffet at C Sharp Press, and I would often talk about how weird it is that we get complaints that they thought they were buying my book and they were getting the anarchist cookbook, and it had nothing to do with Food Not Bombs. So then the other thing that happened is um, uh, a number of Food Not Bombs kids got framed um, on terrorism charges, including three kids in at Occupy Cleveland who were sucked into a FBI designed bomb plot, and that part of the evidence was the Anarchist Cookbook, and they had circled the C4. And so then the final straw for me was then these two women, Muslim women in Queens, New York, were arrested on terrorism charges, and the only evidence was the copy of the Anarchist Cookbook that the FBI gave them with the C4 directions circled. That was all in there. It was a 7-page complaint, and that was all there was in it. So I said, look, I'm going to dilute that first book and with real anarchism and about anarchism. And so I wrote William Powell, who at that time was a headmaster at a private Christian school in Kuala Lumpur. And I said, look, I'm going to take your denunciation of the Anarchist Cookbook, which he had written himself as on Amazon, as an Amazon review. And I said, I'm going to use that as the forward to my book. And then I got Chris Hedges to write his was I guess, I don't remember which is the forward or the preface. But anyway, Chris Hedges wrote the forward, and I took William Powell's denunciation of his original book. And then I just rewrote the entire book to be about anarchism. So and that fortunately seems to be diluting the original book, which is actually sold by there's these I think two different publishing companies believe that they own the rights to William Powell's book, and at one point they were like suing each other and stuff like that, and they're just trying to make money off of that title, but now the Anarchist Cookbook itself is that I wrote is doing really well because it does talk about, like anarchist vision about private ownership of property. It's got, it's anything you would want to, it's like it's about anarchism. and it's about how to live as an anarchist and how to do mutual aid projects as an anarchist. So I have like things on pirate radio and squatting and you know how to organize a book tour, how to organize a meeting, how to it's DIY everything. Because if you're going to be an anarchist, it's your responsibility to make things happen with your community, and you're not calling somebody up to have them do it instead, and lead you, because the idea is there's not supposed to be any really leaders. It's you might be a person with more knowledge about a certain thing, and have some in a certain sense a leadership thing, but you're trying to create a non-hierarchical structure of community and cooperation, and focusing on stuff that that is important to being alive, like art and culture and music and food and things of those nature. So that's what's in the Anarchist Cookbook that I have written, and why I wrote that book. And I have to say, I've not heard of any more people being framed using the Anarchist Cookbook. So in that regard, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. Yeah. So, what would you say to people about like how they can help with Food Not Bombs? How can people help out with that?
Well, the thing is to start a Food Not Bombs or to join a local Food Not Bombs. So and so Hungry for Peace and the Anarchist Cookbook, both, I believe, are still on the foodnotbombs.net website for free as a PDF. But you can also, of course, buy the book. And or you can just go to foodnotbombs.net, and up there, one of the links says volunteer. So you can click on volunteer, and one is all the possible things you might potentially do as a volunteer in your local Food Not Bombs that already exists. Another is 7 steps to starting the Food Not Bombs. So it's going to be very interesting, because a lot of it's the history of the publication 7 steps to starting the Food Not Bombs has really changed with technology and history over time. Because I remember in the very first edition, I was encouraging people to buy this new thing called an answering machine, because it just had been invented. And that way, I tell you in my little flyer that you could leave a mess. Somebody will be able to leave a message on your answering machine. Then there was a period where I had thought, well, you could get a MySpace. That's really cool, because I know, Johannesburg Food Not Bombs had a MySpace, and that's the only way I was communicating with them. Um, and so on. So then it's evolved. So now with the collapse of social media, it'll be really interesting. But currently, what seems to be happening, and actually we have these global Zoom meetings, which we just had one like last Saturday, and what we are like trying to get our own independent kind of social media thing that's separate somewhat from, as much as possible, from the corporate control. And So anyway, initially I think the starting of Food Not Bombs is one of the most transformative things that you can do to help Food Not Bombs. And basically, you want to organize a meeting, get a bunch of people together. It might mean that you're making flyers saying you're going to all meet at the park or at a library or something. And then you would go out and you would find sources of food. So you'd go to usually smaller grocery stores and talk to produce workers and ask them if they're throwing out any food, and set up a schedule. You might want to typically start like every Saturday you're going to feed people somewhere, but you also so you might be doing groceries at this spot as well as a vegan meal, and then but there's all kinds of it can be very inventive. That's the thing, is not to put like you've got to do it this way type of thing. But then, so I suggest you start getting food pickups, and then you deliver that to people that need it, and then start your meal. Try to find a public, high visibility location because part of the idea is to bring housed and unhoused people together. So housed people get to see really the personality and have personal direct connections with unhoused people on an ongoing and regular basis, and also for unhoused people to have that interaction with housed people, because the state has completely ghettoized it. So you got all your homeless services in one place, and you're just kind of in this homeless industrial thing all the time, or you're or often the case, or and then house people just see you on the doorways and stuff and ignore you and don't interact with you. So by having this meal together, um, you want to find a good public space. So that's one of the main things that the state tries to do, is to keep that from happening. So for instance, the issue in Houston where they're ticketing people every time they serve food, they're trying to get Houston Food Not Bombs to leave the plaza in front of the downtown library and go underneath this freeway in this um, old maintenance yard next to a police precinct and serve there. But we're trying to change society, so that does not work for us. And one of the ways of changing society is building this solidarity between housed and unhoused people. So then the next the and then you probably want, like here we have a meeting every Monday night to decide what we're going to do, schedule during the week, and so on. And that's where we, hand out the money for different, whatever it is, people are getting gas or drive the vehicle, things like that. And then you just have this pattern, and you put out flyers, and you might have a Facebook page for your group, an Instagram page, things like that. That's very common now. And although I'm getting more and more skeptical of all that stuff, but still, that's what it's one of the ways we've been communicating. And then contact foodnotbombs.net. There's like a place you can what's maps at foodnotbombs.info. You send in like, well, we serve on this day, this is how you contact us in our town, and so on. And then we are actually there's now like an effort to really get that our contact map more accurate and more user friendly, and so on. That was a big part of our last Saturday's world meeting. So
Hmm.
anyway, so that's the thing. And then also, Food Not Bombs chapters typically will take food to other actions, right? And that's really important. So if, I'm hoping there's going to be huge anti-war actions um, in the near future, because that's desperately needed. You're also going to see
Great.
a of many more homeless people as things collapse. And one of the reasons that we're vegan is because we had no money when we started. We still don't have any money, but we didn't want to have to buy refrigeration and all that to have the food be safe. You know, so that was part of our philosophy. And so this means that people have we had, like, Tony was 14 and started LA Food Not Bombs, and he wasn't even able to drive. He had to get older kids to drive for him and stuff. But he got it going with virtually no money. Um, so that's the idea, is that you're actually experiencing this yourself. You're out there on the streets. You get to meet all kinds of interesting people and have these conversations about the future, and create a community. And I think that's and you can find all that out on foodnotbombs.net. And that's where the hunger hotline toll free number 1-800-884-1136 is. Or you can write me, Keith at foodnotbombs.net. And I get a lot of local chapters will have their schedule listed at 211. So people, when and frequently Food Not Bombs is like the thing that is actually does respond to calls that go through 211. So every town has a 211, or counties, I suspect, is how it's organized. And then you could be listed. Our meals are every Saturday at this time in this place. Happy Cow, I've encouraged Food Not Bombs chapters to list their meal on Happy Cows. Another way to get people that are just interested in eating vegan meals and vegetarian meals to find your meal, things like that. So, and we're trying to come up with like a united worldwide kind of strategy against this war, which has been really fascinating, because the people who grew up in what were Soviet dominated countries were actually arguing to support NATO, which was fascinating.
Hmm.
And now that the war is dragged, because we were going to have a joint statement, and I was advocating that we be against Russia and we'd be against NATO. And I got blocked in the world meeting like 6 months ago for that, and we decided to
Wow.
abandon it because we could never come to an agreement. Now the recent world meeting, yeah, no, NATO, we get it. You know, we see what's happening. So this
Yeah.
evolution of that has been really fascinating. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All that's really amazing, and thank you for that information and how people can help out. What's a final message you want to leave the audience with before we close off here?
well, as bleak as this whole like centralized, you know, like World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, neoliberal structural adjustment clampdown that is occurring, um, I think there's a lot of hope in fighting back, and I really encourage people to start like organizing resistance to the stuff that like to me like resisting the economic and political system and not total non cooperation with it is our strongest point. I think that being autonomous and outside the system and building our own community is how we can best resist like the war. Although I think massive protests on the streets against the war is good. I certainly would ignore elections. Absolutely, that's a divide and conquer game that
Mm.
the ruling class is playing, and um, you know, and I think that's really, and I do think a lot of Americans are kind of coming around to that. It's so obvious that the two main political parties are completely bunk and are
Yeah.
only for the rich. So there's many more of us than there are of them, and I've been really inspired. I've been very badly injured for like 6 weeks, and so I've been spending a lot of my time just with live streams of protests in Paris and throughout France. So I find that really fascinating. Um, you know, if you have to lay around a bunch, so um, that keeps your spirits up. But yeah, and then read,
Yeah.
use cash. Don't. I think there's a lot of hope,
Yeah.
and I really and particularly younger people. Don't be confined to the way that the corporate state is trying to force a dystopian future on us, and push back.
Yeah, yeah, Keith McHenry, thank you very much. I think those are really strong messages, and I concur with that. And to everyone else, stay informed. And Keith, I would love to have you back on again for future discussions. I think
Yeah,
there's a lot
absolutely.
more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's
Thank
beautiful.
you. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I remember